Hi everyone, welcome to the Institute for this talk on the internal situation in Iran. As the latest rounds of talks ended on a positive but largely inconclusive note last week, many are speculating on what's next and whether a deal can be reached on Iran's controversial nuclear program, especially in the run-up to the presidential elections. Iran's constantly shifting and largely opaque political system makes it very hard to predict the outcome of the elections, who is in charge and who gives orders, who is a part of what faction, and also for the negotiators, who to talk to. Our guests today have just come back from Tehran and are here to share their insights on the current internal situation. Dr. Parsi, on my left, is a senior research fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, based in Paris. He's an expert on Iran's domestic political developments and their foreign policy implications, also on governance and political culture in Iran, as well as regional relations between states. There's a slight change in the program. I know you were expecting to have just Dr. Parsi speak, but you're going to get a two-for-one deal today. And you have Mohammed Ali Shabani, who is a doctoral researcher at SOAS, who frequently travels back and forth between here and Iran. He used to work with various think tanks in Tehran. He'll be offering some commentary after Dr. Parsi. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I will begin, I think, with the talks, since I think that's where people tend to focus. I think what's important with these talks and the latest developments is that we are finally getting to a point where the true sense of the word and the concept of reciprocity is sinking in. Basically, for the last year or so, people have been talking about reciprocity, and reciprocity seems to have meant that we take a step when the other side takes a step. But that's only half of the story. The other side of it, of course, is that you also need to make sure that your step is reciprocal in weight and substance to what the other side is offering. And I think that's the path that we are now slowly embarking upon, which is very good, and that's the positive bit. Now, of course, that does not mean that they will get around to actually calibrate exactly how much they have to and are willing to give for what they're getting from the other side. And this works both ways. But I think if one looks at how things are looking from the view in Tehran, this is positive, though of course in and of itself just the beginning and not sufficient. As for the deal itself, I think I'm not going to get into the details of it. I'm not privy to any fantastic juicy gossip or intelligence on that. But I think it's important to remember that whatever process we have cannot be a real process unless people agree somewhere in largely defined terms on what the end goal is. And that end goal has to be strategic in two senses. It has to be strategic in the sense of this is the end goal for the nuclear issue as such, but it also has to be strategic in a much larger sense, in that it defines broadly what kind of relationship Iran, the EU in particular, and the US are going to have with one another once this headache is over. And I think that's perhaps the bit that people have spent far too little time to think about, because they are busy with the present, if you will. But I think it's very difficult to see the way stations of the negotiations unless you know what the end station is and where it is. And that's something that people should basically spend more time on. That, of course, brings us to the other part of it, which is the domestic developments in Iran. I think it's only fair to say that the perspective from Tehran, and I would concur with that to some degree at least, is that there's much more dynamism in what's going on inside the country than what's going on in the nuclear negotiations. We've now reached a point where the ritualistic element of the negotiations are tedious, to say the least, and so no one really has that much hope for any fantastic dramatic developments, the latest positive signs notwithstanding. What's more in focus in Tehran is Basically, who is going to be running for president? Where is this going to go? Because in the end, all politics is domestic in Iran as everywhere else. And I think I'm going to leave some of the more detailed insights for Muhammad to give you, but I think it's important to remember and stress the principle that we are not dealing with a unified rational actor as our political science literature would like us to believe, not in Washington and not in Tehran. This is not a monolithical system where there is one person at the top deciding everything and then everyone else falls in line. It is simply not that simple. And that in itself also means that it is not predictable. I mean, I think it's quite fascinating that despite what everyone says in terms of Iran being a dictatorship or whatever, etc., the fact remains that the last 4 presidential elections have been surprises. And there is absolutely nothing at the moment indicating that the next presidential election will not be a surprise. We don't know who the candidates are. We won't know until very late in the game. We really don't know how broadly within the spectrum the candidates will be allowed to stand. And we don't know where the Supreme Leader stands on who ought to win and how much they are willing to do, so to speak, to make sure that that person wins. So, again, it's very much an open field. And that is not an anomaly. I think it's only if you really look at it as a system where everything is supposedly predictable and very monolithical that these elections become an anomaly. But after 4 of them, of these anomalies, I mean, you have to start wondering about your basic way of understanding the system. And I would say that that, by definition, indicates that it's actually the other way around. Yes, it is not open, democratic, etc., but it is also not so streamlined to be predictable. And that means that it is also not a system where one single entity, group, faction, or person really can just decide and get everyone else to just tag along. There's very much a negotiated, for good or better, worse, finding another term for it, throughout, regardless of whether it's a domestic issue or it's a foreign policy issue. And in this sense, it is also important to remember that the dynamics of the nuclear issue and Iranian foreign policy, to a large degree, is an extension of what kind of debate and atmosphere you have on the domestic scene. So the nuclear issue is not seen as an issue set apart from everything else, where suddenly everyone becomes serious and just deals with foreign policy. It is part of the domestic political football game, and it is used as a weapon against other groups within that domestic game, as much as being discussed on the substance of the issue itself. And the best example of that, of course, is if you look at how President Ahmadinejad early on, in his, when he was a candidate the first time, and then in his presidency, was very keen on making sure that Iran would have a much more hardline attitude, not give in as much, etc., and he criticized the previous negotiating teams and so on. And then when he himself wanted the deal, it was exactly those groups he had criticized before who took the opportunity to criticize him. And of course, their criticism had really nothing to do with the substance of the deal at hand, but had more to do with who was going to get credit if this thing would actually work. And as long as it didn't work, it was something you could pin the blame on someone else. So again, it's a question of political football inside as much as it is on the substance of the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Dina and ISS, for inviting me here today. Me and Dr. Parsi, we agree on most points. So as he pointed out, what I will be doing is elaborating basically on his points. And before I begin talking about domestic politics in Iran, there's a saying that if you have 3 Iranians in a room, you will have 5 opinions. So keep in mind that whatever I say or anybody else say, you should take it with a grain of salt because it's so divided in Iran. What we have in Iran, I think, in terms of domestic politics, the main points you should take away from today, I believe, is that there is domestic politics. It exists. And this might sound like very obvious, but I think it's not that obvious for a lot of observers who are based here in London and Washington. The Islamic Republic, in my view, is not a one-man show, has never been a one-man show. And Dr. Parsi was talking about talking about negotiating throughout in terms of decision making, both on domestic matters and foreign policy matters. What you can refer to that as is rule by consensus. That's what we have in Iran. There's a circle of people involved in decision making, and this circle has grown and it has reduced in size depending on the domestic developments. For example, after 2009, this circle reduced in size, and now ahead of the coming election, I can imagine it will grow again. So you have to think in terms of decision making. It's not a one-man show. It's never been that way. And now with the domestic situation, I think ahead of the elections, the main issues can be divided into three different categories. One is the so-called principlist camp, the conservatives. Will they be able to unite and appoint one candidate or not? This is one question. The second question is, who will President Ahmadinejad appoint as his candidate? Who will he back as a candidate? This will be a major game changer, and so far it's still not clear who he's going to appoint. I'll get more into detail further on in my talk. And the third point I should keep in mind are the reformists, which also are just as divided as the conservatives. So going back to my first point about the conservatives being divided, what we have right now is an effort among the principlist camp who are opposed to President Ahmadinejad is to form a coalition to be able to unite on a single candidate so they won't split the vote. The conservatives, you have to keep in mind, haven't been able to unite on a single candidate in previous elections, so I do not personally see it as likely this time either. But it is worthy of mention to say that we have something called the 2+1 coalition. And this 2+1 coalition is an initiative to field former Parliament Speaker Ghulam Ali Haddad and the former Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Velayati, who is also a foreign policy advisor to the Supreme Leader, as well as the current Tehran Mayor Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. The point of this coalition is to, again, field a unitary candidate for a principlist. But in my view, the main point, apart from this, is to gain as much advantage from Mayor Ghalibaf's attractiveness in Tehran for voters, but containing within a structure that will not allow him to seize power. You have to keep in mind that in Iran, the main point of the election, apart from obviously picking a leader, is the legitimacy it affords to the system. In Iran, voter participation is often heralded as a major litmus test of legitimacy. In 2009, we had voter participation of 84%. Even though it was 25% higher than the previous elections, overall in Iranian presidential elections, we had on average 60 to 70% participation. This is huge. And Iranian leaders often point to this level of voter participation as a major backing for the system. And they always point to how their elections, as opposed to other countries, are relatively more free. Going to my second point about the Ahmadinejad candidate. Again, it's not clear yet. The names that have been put forward are his former chief of staff and the current representative of Iran to the non-aligned movement, Mashai. Mashai is a very controversial figure. He is often referred to as a member of the deviant current by his opponents who are more dominant in the political system. And Ahmadinejad and Mashai are often accused of pursuing an anti-clerical kind of populist brand of nationalism. And one point in which you can portray this kind of policy is Mashai's formulation of the doctrine of Maktab-e-Irani, which is Iranian school of thought in reference to the type of Islam and type of political system we have in Iran. So he's very exceptionalist in the way he defines Iran. And this, again, was heavily criticized by his opponents because, according to the Iranian constitution, the role of Islamic Republic is to defend the rights of all Muslims, and it's quite transnationalist in the constitution. So it's kind of frowned upon in the Iranian political culture to be too nationalist, even though you shouldn't discount nationalism as a major political force. Now, going back to my third point, the reformists, you can split them into three camps. One camp will not participate. Based on what happened in 2009, they do not believe that it's prudent for them to participate. They do not see any good outcome coming from it, and they will not announce it, but they will not participate. The second camp are people who will participate, but on conditions. And among these figures, you have people like opposition leader Mir Hossein Mousavi, who has, even though he's in house arrest, has said that we will participate in the election. Apart from being freed, he wants the freeing of people who have been detained, and reformation of election law, establishment of a commission to find out what happened in 2009, etc. And President Khatami, former President Khatami, has accepted Mir Hossein Mousavi's demands, but he hasn't clearly outlined whether or not he will participate. And there are a lot of rumors in Tehran about him participating. Keep in mind that he's a very popular figure in Iran. For example, in the parliamentary elections that we had the other year, he was very ambiguous about participating, but in the last moment he did cast his ballot. And he was heavily attacked for this by many in the opposition, but at the end of the day, I think many people in Iran look back at the reformist era before Ahmadinejad with excitement and enjoyment, because they appreciate that the climate was very different, and they attribute a lot of the positive atmosphere that existed in Iran back then to Khatami. So keep in mind that he's quite popular still in Iran. And the third group of reformists are people who will participate without any kind of conditions. And among these, you can find the head of the Democracy Party. His name is Kaval Kebian. And people attack him as sometimes not actually being reformist or being opportunist, etc. But you could count him as part of the reformist movement. Now, again, going back to my point about rule of consensus in Iran, I believe the objective of the higher authorities is to include the reformists in the political process. It's more convenient for them, and also it stabilizes the political situation. And as part of their attempts to goad the reformists into entering the political process again, I believe the government is pursuing something you could refer to as a dual track approach. On the one hand, they are still open to reformist participation. Khatami is still allowed to move freely. He's speaking his mind. And just the other week, we had, for the first time since 2009, a reformist meeting with the supreme leader. 3 leading reformists were invited to his office, and they had a meeting, and this was very significant because this hasn't happened in 4 years. On the other hand, we've had closures or arrests of many newspaper editors, many journalists in recent weeks. And again, I believe this is part of a dual track approach to put pressure on the reformists, but at the same time leaving a way open for them to participate in the political process. And I believe the intention behind this is to allow them to participate in the political process on the government's terms. So not just to participate on any terms, but on specific terms. And going through quickly the candidates, again, as Dr. Parsi pointed out, it's too early to speculate about who's going to participate. There are several candidates who've announced their candidacy, but in Iran, you're formally not allowed to actually campaign up until a few weeks before the elections. Quickly, from the reformist camps, we had former First Vice President Aref, and you have his predecessor, Mohammad Ali Najafi, and former Intelligence Minister Fallahian, who you can dispute is a reformist or not, but he was an intelligence minister during the Khatami era. And again, we have Kaval Kebian. Among these, I do not believe that any of them are, how should I put it, are charismatic enough to be able to attract the kind of votes that somebody like Khatami would be able to attract. And if you have from the other side, from the Ahmadinejad camp, again, we have people like Niksad and Mashai. Niksad is a minister of roads, and he's a, again, very low-profile candidate, but he's also being put forth as a potential candidate from the Ahmadinejad camp. And from the principalist, again, you have the Haddad Adel, former parliament speaker, former foreign minister, Valayati, and also Qalibov. And we have current foreign minister Ali Akbar Salehi, who is a technocrat, and also current nuclear negotiator Saeed Jalili, potentially running for office. And what I want to point out about the significance of the election in terms of the nuclear issue, because again, that's what this talk is about, I believe, indirectly, is that the significance of the next president is not his different influence or different role in decision-making or on the nuclear issue. I believe the significance is the senior leadership's ability to be able to channel new initiatives through him and be able to easily deflect blame on him should there be diplomatic failure. And again, this goes back to the basic recipe for solving of the nuclear issue, which apart from reciprocity, as Dr. Parsi pointed out, is face saving for Iran. Iran will need to save face. And under current conditions, they cannot suddenly change their position, especially from the senior leadership. So the most convenient route to be able to save face by altering or softening your position without being seen as weak is to channel initiatives through the next president. And again, this directly feeds into the nuclear issue. Another major issue to do with the nuclear question, apart from saving face and reciprocity in any kind of deal, is Iran's preference for negotiating from a position of strength. You have to really appreciate this. Under weakened conditions, Iran will not seriously negotiate. And just to give you an idea of the kind of obstacles that the senior leadership faces, because again, even though the supreme leader is the ultimate decision maker, he is not the sole decision maker. And you have to distinguish between these different points. He has a lot of constituencies he has to listen to and take into account. And to give you one idea of this, for example, even though we have hardliners who oppose any kind of deal or serious negotiations under current conditions, on the other side of the spectrum, we have people like nationalist religious figures, so-called Melli Mazhabis, who wrote an open letter to the supreme leader a couple of weeks ago, in which they said that Iran should not negotiate with the United States under current conditions because Iran will not be able to extract any significant concessions due to its perceived weakened position. So we have people not just on the one side of the spectrum opposing negotiations, we have people on the other side as well. So it's quite wide. And directly feeding into Almaty, what happened there in Kazakhstan, the Iranian negotiators have heralded them as a turning point, pointing again to how for the first time tangible sanctions relief were put on the table by the P5+1. And it's my personal opinion that this doesn't only got to do with the breakthrough in Kazakhstan, but it also got to do with domestic politics. Again, Saeed Jalili, the chief nuclear negotiator, is a potential presidential candidate, and there is an interest in presenting progress under his tenure as a point of strength, which he can then use in his own campaign. So you should definitely keep that in mind. And again, this goes back to Dr. Parsi's point about how the nuclear issue is used as a football in domestic politics. And a final point that I want to bring up is the issue of public opinion. We had a Gallup poll a couple of weeks ago. Again, I want to just, before I bring up these figures, that of course you could dispute the accuracy of polls carried out in places like Iran. I should keep this in mind. But from my own experiences coming back and forth to Iran, I largely agree with the outcome of this poll. This poll said that 63% of Iranians back the nuclear program, even though over 80% report personally feeling harmed by the sanctions. And this is significant, not just because of this poll. We had previous polls as well confirming the same trend. A couple of months ago, we had a poll carried out by a researcher at the University of Maryland, and he pointed out in his poll that 55% of Iranians do not agree with any kind of final nuclear deal in which you do not have enrichment on Iranian soil. So I believe that enrichment on Iranian soil is a red line. Now, the level and extent of that enrichment, that's a different question. And if you look at a recent book, the memoir of former chief nuclear negotiator Hassan Rouhani, he argues in his book, or reveals, how during his tenure as chief nuclear negotiator, there are members of parliament invited to sessions of the Foreign Policy Commission of the Supreme National Security Council, which handles the nuclear question. And the members of parliament were invited to convey the views of their constituents on the nuclear issue. And Dr. Rouhani also reveals that domestic opinion polls were frequently carried out, not just by authorities, civilian authorities, but also by the intelligence ministry. So they keep a very close watch on public opinion on the nuclear issue. And I think this directly feeds into Iran's posture. I should definitely keep this in mind because the support for the nuclear program is a double-edged sword in my view. It does provide backing for the government to pursue its current hard line, but at the same time it constricts its options because again it needs to save face. So if you have a situation in which the vast majority of the population have endured sanctions for over a decade now and they still support the nuclear program, it's virtually impossible for the Iranian government to move back and completely cry uncle. That's not possible. Again, this goes back to my whole point about the supreme leader not being the sole decision maker, but the ultimate decision maker, and how the Islamic Republic, in my view, is not a one-man show. And again, my main point here about domestic politics in Iran is that there is domestic politics. I should definitely keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, for that presentation. It's very interesting. On the nuclear program's popularity, I absolutely agree with you, which is why I think the only way that we're going to be able to get a solution to the nuclear issue in Iran, an acceptable solution for Iran, is for some kind of sanctions relief to be included, but also, as you said, for Iran's right to enrichment somehow be recognized. But in terms of that poll, the one difference that they didn't make, and the one question that I would raise, is that although Iran's nuclear program at the moment is very popular, they did not differentiate between Iran's civilian nuclear program and Iran's weapons, or likelihood for a weapons program. And there have been many polls done in the past on that, and every time the weapons issue comes up, Iranians tend to say, well, we don't really think it's worth it, or the pain that we're going through at the moment, is it really worth it? The enrichment issue is much more tied to nationalism, and that's different. But on the weapons issue, it's very different. So anyway, worth talking about. Before I open it up to questions, I might take the chair's prerogative and ask a couple myself, if that's all right. Firstly, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what issues Iranian candidates are going to be running on this year. What are going to be the main issues? I mean, is sanctions going to be one, the economy, foreign policy, the nuclear program? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And also your thoughts on the candidates' popularity, the potential candidates' popularity in Iran. I mean, do we get the sense that the reformists are going to be ahead, or the principalists, and who within those camps are more popular? Would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I think the primary issue in the elections is going to be the economy, because that's the one thing that really troubles everyone, high and low, is how the economy is, well, not developing, but rather the free fall which it is in. Now, it's important to remember that if you talk to economists, they will be much less panicky about the Iranian economy, because if you look at the numbers, things are not necessarily the kind of total disaster that people give the impression of thinking that it is. But again, this goes back to the fact that this is as much about psychology as it is about actual numbers on an Excel sheet. And for most people in Iran, the problem at the moment is that they have no confidence in how the economy is run and where it is heading. The way the prices are developing, inflation, unemployment, and the problem the government and the state sector of the economy has in terms of exporting goods and getting actual money for it, or something that can be used domestically, all these things are not confidence inspiring. Now, that does not mean that the state is suddenly running out of money or will collapse tomorrow, as some people seem to want to think, but it does mean that for the average person, this is a huge element of uncertainty and anxiety. And that is what the candidates must, one way or another, address. I think that's absolutely the most crucial issue. Now, when it comes to the popularity, I think one of the problems like that, for instance, the Supreme Leader will have in terms of, well, he's not going to back any particular candidate, probably, at least not openly, but in terms of the candidates that he would like to see, is that you have a bit of a seesaw. You have the people who are close in confidence with him, but they tend to be people that will not attract voters. If nothing else, because their personalities are not the kind that will, you won't have 50,000 people in a rally screaming their name, because they're not that kind of people. And that's a problem. So you have on the one hand people that he can trust, but they're perhaps not voter magnets. And then you have people that he perhaps doesn't trust as much, but who are people who can get things done. And that's the real seesaw. He needs someone who can get things done. On the other hand, he would prefer, or actually I think by now, he is adamant that there will be no more surprises. I mean, Ahmadinejad's second term was basically just one big, very bad surprise upon a surprise. And he wants calm, and he wants predictability as far as he himself is concerned regarding the new president. So that's going to be a problem. Now, in terms of the actual candidates, again, as Mohammed mentioned, I mean, you have all kinds of names floating around. It's very difficult at this point to really know who is going to be allowed to be a contender and who's going to be a serious contender. For show, if nothing else, most likely there will be at least one reformist candidate. In terms of the Conservatives, again, I doubt very much that the 2+1 will work because they are not compatible as people. They don't get along, and they have very different ideas about what weight they would have within that 2+1 coalition. Perhaps it's a bit like the rock band. Everyone thinks they're the most important part of the rock band, and obviously that's not going to work. And then you have the really big joker in the game, which is whether someone from the Ahmadinejad camp will make it through all the loopholes and stand as a candidate. My hunch would be that if Mashai is allowed to stand, he will get a lot of votes. Because if nothing else, he has worked with a person who has managed to hone the artistic skill of populism in Iranian politics more than anyone else. So regardless of the substance in terms of what he suggests as solutions for the problems of the country, he will be able to message it probably more effectively than most of the other candidates that we see fielded at the moment.
Thank you.
Just like to add that, like all other countries, politics in Iran is local. All politics is local. And a major thing I believe that Western policymakers need to understand is that even though we associate Iran with the nuclear program and the sanctions here, that's not the only thing people in Tehran are discussing. And when I was there, I really realized that the main issue on the agenda was the presidential elections and domestic politics. Regarding the economy, that is definitely the most important issue. That's number one. Even though the nuclear issue feeds into this along with the sanctions, keep in mind that the economic situation, again, repeating basically what Dr. Parsi had to say, it's not as bad as people argue. IMF argues that today, this year, we're going to have a recession for the first time in decades. But at the same time, the Iranian economy is going to rebound next year and the year after. It's going to grow again. If you want a litmus test of consumer confidence, look at the US dollar rate on the free market. It doesn't reflect realities, it reflects confidence. And that, believe again, that's the main enemy of any business, any economic activity. It's a lack of confidence. Iran at the end of 2011 had $100 billion in foreign exchange reserves accumulated during the administration of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and that those reserves have not been significantly depleted, in my view. So there is no issue of accessibility of foreign exchange. At the same time, the dollar rate has tripled. So if you want a litmus test of how people perceive their future, their expectations, and their confidence, look at the dollar rate, and that doesn't look good. And again, going back to my argument about business, the main enemy of any business is lack of stability and lack of confidence. So these are psychological factors which may turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. About the candidates, the 2+1 coalition, again, I believe that the point is to unify the principalist candidates so as not to split the vote and contain the popular Tehran mayor within this structure so as to make maximum use of his popularity in Tehran, because they need to get people in Tehran to vote. That's a really important issue this time. Even if you have people outside Tehran not voting or voting, that's separate. You need people in Tehran to vote, especially after 2009. He is very popular in the capital. If he doesn't run or if he's not available, as a candidate, directly or indirectly, I believe that'll be a major blow. Representatives from the 2+1 have claimed that their opinion polls show they have 80% of votes, these three candidates. Well, you should take this with a grain of salt. There are other polls pointing to how Ghalibaf, the Tehran mayor, is the most popular of these candidates. Again, this goes back to my argument about how they want to keep him in the election, but perhaps not in a way that he's fully free. Among other candidates, I believe that former President Khatami is the most popular. There are some opinion polls pointing to support in the region of 30 to 35%, which would be in line with 2009. A couple of weeks before the elections back then, there was a opinion poll carried out by the website Aleph, which is run by the principalists. And it said that Khatami had 34% of votes, while Mir Hossein Mousavi had 1% of votes. And then Khatami decided to step aside and back Mousavi. And obviously all of those votes were transferred. That just gives you an idea of how popular he is up until this day. And regarding Mashai, Ahmadinejad has been very bold in these past couple of years. He has shown an ability to not go down without a fight. I don't believe he will do so. And he's actually gone so far as to threaten to cancel the elections if the Guardian Council, the vetting body, disqualifies any candidate from running without any sound basis. I don't believe he's going to go through with it, but I believe this just goes to show his kind of posture right now. He's not backing down. And obviously the strain of thinking he represents is anti-clerical. And it's very populist, and this resonates with a large portion of the population. You should keep this in mind. Even though he's Islamist, he represents a different strain of Islamism than what's in the mainstream right now in Iran. And this resonates with the population, and he has a good chance of gaining votes. But again, I believe the most popular candidate is Khatami, if he becomes a candidate.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll open the floor to questions. Could you please state your name and affiliation? And then just one more thing, I'll probably group 2 or 3 questions together before answers. Go ahead.
I'm Tom Fenton, an American journalist.
Thank you.
I have a question about the Pasdaran. Given their substantial involvement in the economy, I wondered what role, what weight, what influence they might have in domestic politics.
Thank you.
Thanks. George Lambrakis, a retired American diplomat who served in Iran at the time of the revolution. I'd like to ask about isolation and the end game, which were both brought up. Not isolation so much. There is an impression that you have tried to dissipate, which is that the supreme leader can really make decisions. You're suggesting that he has a lot of difficulty doing that. The question is this also true on the nuclear issue in the final analysis? And is the top leadership, perhaps not one person, are they as isolated as perhaps Saddam Hussein was in not knowing what the rest of the world is likely to do and assuming they will do what you think you would do in that circumstance, which can go wrong? And as far as the end game goes, what needs to be in the end game? Do you need to have a promise that you will not overthrow the regime, or can you just get rid of sanctions? Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any other one more question? No? Oh, there you go.
Thank you. Matthew Vick, Foreign Office. A bit of a processy point, I guess. At what point after the elections, or sort of date, month, will a new president be in place and have the ability to have a new initiative channeled through them?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Do you want to give it a shot first?
Okay. Well, regarding the IRGC, I think it's important to, let me put it like this. The Iranian system is a series of networks with people represented from all kinds of institutions. And these networks are formed on all kinds of bases. You know, they went to the front together, they went to university together, they come from the same part of the country, etc. And this is then how both business, politics, and everything else is organized. So you cannot say that the IRGC, the Pasdaran, have one set of ideas or they want one thing, because they are not one. They are a conglomerate at best, with both in terms of the fact that they have business interests, but also the fact that, you know, they have in a sense seeped into everything else that's going on in society. Now, if you look at during Khatami's time, the general estimation was that the overwhelming majority of the rank and file of the Pasdaran voted for Khatami. So again, it shows that even though we tend to think of the Pasdaran as the kind of a hardcore, hardliners, Praetorian Guard kind of institution, it is not that simple. Then, of course, you also had generational shifts in terms of command structure, etc. So they have a lot of economic interests. And I would say that probably, as far as they're concerned, the sanctions regime, for instance, isn't really a problem. It just increases the margin of profit for what they can get in and out, which, of course, they are better at doing than anyone else. So, just to give you an idea of their role, if you will. Now, regarding isolation and end game, I think you cannot compare Iran to, let's say, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or for that matter, Bashar al-Assad's Syria, exactly because of the fact that Iran is an oligarchy. It is not a dictatorship. It is not autocratic in that sense yet. I mean, you could say perhaps there are signs of a trend that in 10 years' time would, etc., etc. But for the moment and in the previous 30 years, that has not been the case.
The oligarchs isolated?
The oligarchs, I think, well, I mean, we might tend to think that they are more isolated than they are because from our perspective, the way in which they react and the way in which they phrase their reactions are at best tone deaf from our way of our sensitivities and how you go about addressing issues. Now that, of course, tells you that they could really use a good PR firm, but whether that means that their idea of what's going on in the world is so skewed or so bad, I'm not so sure. I think there's a variation there. And the variation has as much to do with the fact that many people, like elsewhere, tend to have ideological glasses on even though they think they don't. But there are those, of course, who are also hyper-realistic and who see all these things in quite clear terms of national interest or self-interest. And perhaps sometimes they have difficulty understanding various Western positions because it doesn't make sense from how they would understand our self-interest. So in that sense, I don't think they are that isolated. I think the supreme leader is obviously a very important position and a very important person. But again, as Muhammad said, and as I try to say as well, I don't think that he decides everything on his own as he likes, because if he did, then it would be very difficult for us to explain what's been going on in the last 15 years. So, if you look at the empirical data, basically, that kind of explanation doesn't really match. I think as far as the end game is concerned, well, I mean, as you probably know, the Algiers Accord of 1980 basically stated that the United States would not try and overthrow the Islamic Republic. So if you want, we should perhaps remind people in the US Congress of that. There's already an agreement where the US has said that it's not going to do that. I think the end game, you can see the end game in two senses. There's the end game of the nuclear negotiations, which people tend to think of in purely technical terms, even though obviously it is framed by politics, and that's why it's so difficult to get somewhere on. And that end game, I think, frankly, if everyone were to confess in private, is not so difficult to figure out. Iran will have enrichment. It will be capped. Iran will sign the additional protocol, etc., etc., etc. And you could say that's the kind of the rational, easy to understand solution. The question is whether everyone is willing to pay the political price to admitting to it and actually signing on to it. That's one end game. But the much more strategic end game, of course, is what kind of relationship or non-relationship does the US and Iran want or are able to have with one another. And that's a much larger issue. And yes, it's a bit of a catch-22, but at least it needs to be addressed. You might not get somewhere on it today, but one needs to think about that. Because frankly, from my perspective as a non-proliferation person, it is somewhat mind-boggling the way people are so obsessed with the nuclear issue. Because, I mean, the US and Iran had problems before anyone even knew, or anyone in Iran had even thought of starting a nuclear program. So all of those things, both areas where there could be mutual interest, but also areas where there are definitely problems, will exist even if we were to be able to solve this problem tomorrow. And I think perhaps for those of us who study European history, there's a saying about Prussia, that most states have an army, but Prussia is a place where the army had a state. And sometimes when people talk about Iran, it seems as if they don't realize it's actually a country that has a nuclear program, but it seems that they think it's a nuclear program that has a country. And that difference of perspective is quite important, because if you think it's a nuclear program with a country, then you're missing the political context, and you're missing the political framework in which those negotiations must take place. But if you understand that it's a country with a nuclear program, you see that there is a panoply of other interests and dimensions where you could both make a headway while this one is just festering, but also that will continue and will live on after this issue is solved, if it hopefully is solved.
Thank you. You want to take?
Again, keep stealing my points. The IRGC, the Pastoran, in my view, are not a monolith at all. And if you want to look at their influence in elections, former members of the IRGC are all over the system. Among the candidates, people like Qalibov, the mayor, is a former IRGC Air Force officer, or he was head of the Air Force, appointed directly by the Supreme Leader. There are people, Parliament Chief Ali Larijani, also former IRGC, many other figures. Saeed Jalili lost a leg fighting in the Iran-Iraq war. So I think we should keep a balanced view of the IRGC's influence. It's not often direct, and it's not a monolith. About isolation, which you wondered about, I do not believe that Supreme Leader is, again, as Dr. Parsi pointed out, as isolated as Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad. I think there is a lot of people around him who are in tune with what's happening in society. And I believe that the opposition that comes from the Supreme Leader's office to dialogue on the current circumstances doesn't stem from ideological opposition to relations with the United States. I believe that's a false analogy. I believe that if you look at it in realist terms, if you're in the playground and you are sensing that you're being bullied by somebody, the worst thing you can do is to satisfy that bully by giving in to the bully's demands. So in political terms, pressure will only, succumbing under pressure will only invite more pressure. I believe this is a very realist point of view. It's not ideological at all, even though it's construed often as being ideological. I believe that the nuclear issue is not a technical issue. I believe it's a political issue. And I believe that in an end game, a final deal on the nuclear issue will involve Iran agreeing to limitations that none of the 189 other members of the NPT will have to endure. Endure limitations, not only the level of enrichment, but also the amount, the output. And this is not regulated by the initial protocol. It's not limited by the subsidiary arrangement 3.1, etc., etc. I believe that Iran will only endure these kinds of limitations, which no other nation will face, if it's directly tied to a resolution of wider strategic issues with the West. And I believe that Iran has consistently shown over the past decades that it's open to dialogue with the West. And it has done so. It's taken moves in that direction practically. In 2001, when the United States wanted to invade Afghanistan, they managed to topple the Taliban regime in a matter of weeks. I don't believe that would be possible without Iranian assistance. Iranian forces supplied intelligence. They were highly coordinated with American forces. There are reports even of at one point American and Iranian special forces fighting alongside each other 500 meters from each other in the battle for Herat, for example. And the thanks Iran got for that, from an Iranian point of view, is to be assigned a member of an axis of evil. So the view from Iran is that they have tried to take practical steps towards a strategic dialogue with the United States, but they have felt that they've been used only for tactical purposes. Going back to the nuclear issue, if Iran endures these limitations, which no other nation will face, and it turns out from an Iranian point of view that this is just a tactical ploy by the United States, and it doesn't lead to a strategic conversation, I believe this dialogue or this agreement will collapse. And that's a far bigger danger than not imminently reaching a nuclear deal. I believe that's something nuclear negotiators definitely have to keep in mind. And one example of how Iran wants to broaden the conversation is how, since Moscow, and even before, it has insisted on including non-nuclear issues in the nuclear talks. Throughout 2011, for example, Saeed Jalili refused to even refer to the talks with the P5+1 as nuclear talks. There was directives in Tehran saying that we have comprehensive talks with the P5+1. And now in Moscow last summer, previous round before the round in Kazakhstan, Iran wanted to include Syria and Bahrain on the agenda. And I believe that's still on the agenda from the Iranian point of view. So this goes to show how Iran wants to broaden the dialogue. And the real danger here is for a deal to be seen as only tactical and not resolving strategic issues. This is a big danger, far bigger danger than Iran not resolving any kind of nuclear issues. A final question from the gentleman from the Foreign Office. The next Iranian president will be inaugurated in August. So the earliest you will see any new initiative from the Iranian point of view, in my view, is probably September or early October, not during the summer.
Thank you. In the next round, I think there was Jury was first. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Gary, a gender and researcher here at the Institute. I was intrigued by your comment about how sanctions may actually be good for the IRGC. Based on this, would you say that sanctions might actually strengthen those connected individuals or oligarchs at the top of Iranian society and who are running its businesses while doing damage to the economy at large? So is there a sort of split, double effect that the sanctions might have? And more generally, how effective have sanctions been at limiting Iranian access to hard currency, which is one of the major stated objectives of the sanctions policy? Thank you.
Thank you for stealing my question, Jury. Gentleman in the front.
Thank you. Gordon Barnes, the London School of Economics. I would just like you to say a little more about this broader relationship between Iran and the international community, particularly from the point of view of what Iranian leaders have said going back to the revolution about how the new regime defines itself by opposition to the United States and other Western countries, that this is something that is special about the regime. To what extent is this something that is still a serious factor in Iranian politics?
And in the nuclear issue.
And in the nuclear issue, of course.
Thank you. And then there were two questions in the back row.
Ali Al-Husseini, a media consultant. Could you please tell us something about the traditional role of the traditional Grand Ayatollahs in Qom, and how agreeable are they with the domestic politics of the regime or not? And what is the relationship between the regime now and those grand established, original, if you like, clerics in Qom? And to what extent could they influence the population in Iran in terms of rallying them into a position against or pro the regime and its politics, in terms of its attitude or position to the foreign issue of negotiations?
The lady next to you had a question?
Danielle Lotion, IISS member. I just wondered if you could speak briefly about the role that the U.S. and the U.S. and Iran's position on Syria factors into domestic politics in Iran. You talk about the economy being the kind of priority issue of the presidential elections, and how is Iranian support for Syria factoring into the discussion? And then, I guess, what challenges does the kind of opposing position of the U.S. and Iran create on Syria? What obstacles does that create for the nuclear program or any kind of dialogue?
Thank you. Would you like to start this time, Mohammed, for a change?
Yeah, sure. The question about the IRGC being strengthened by sanctions. The only thing that has happened, in my view, from what I've seen so far in Iran, of the sanctions, is that when you restrict legal trade and illicit channels, the only thing that happens is that it's being squeezed onto illicit channels. Iran is a country which has, if I'm not mistaken, my geography is not that good, has over a dozen neighbors. It has over 1,500 kilometers of coastline, both on Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea. Iraq is wide open to the west. For the past 30 years, the Kurdistan region has acted as a major transit point for a lot of smuggling. There's many dozens of jetties in the Persian Gulf controlled directly by the IRGC. The only thing that happens when you see a reduction in illicit GDP is that there's an increase in illicit GDP. So keep that in mind. About the access to foreign exchange, right, what's happened right now is that sanctions have targeted, channels such as SWIFT and also the use of dollars in international transactions. Lately, the US Congress has even tried to limit the use of euros. And more recently, we've seen gold sanctions, trying to limit Iran's barter trade with gold with Turkey. One point that you need to keep in mind is that the government in Iran has had a long time to prepare for economic war. In 2008, Iran had, according to consultants that I've talked to, roughly $13 billion in assets here in Europe. Predicting this kind of climate today, the Central Bank of Iran withdrew those assets and purchased gold, an average price of $600 an ounce. The current gold price is roughly $1,700 to $1,800 an ounce. So Iran has $40 billion in gold, partly due to sanctions. So in terms of balance of payments, Iran, even though it's been on an import splurge since its oil income started increasing towards the beginning of the Ahmadinejad's first term, it has adjusted its trade accordingly. When you've seen a drop, for example, in exports, it has adjusted imports accordingly. So there is no kind of balance of trade, balance of payments crisis predicted in the near future. And from consultants I've talked to, they've identified $60 billion in foreign exchange reserves as a comfort level they're satisfied with. And right now, Iran's foreign exchange reserves that are accessible are nowhere near that. So for the foreseeable future, I do not see lack of access to foreign exchange due to sanctions being a major issue. And even then, you have to argue that there are so many loopholes in the sanctions that Iran can still access whatever foreign exchange it has abroad. For example, Iran is using small banks based mainly in Russia to transfer payments. Another major issue is that in 2015, from the current positions of the Chinese leadership, the yuan will become fully convertible. That's a major game changer. So from the Iranian point of view, it can hold out that far, it will have access to a large sum of money. In terms of how Iran defines itself as opposition to the US and Israel, etc., and whether this is in the DNA of the revolutionary government in Iran, I do not believe that's the case. If you look at, again, Iran's behavior, especially during the past 10 years and its efforts to come to terms with the United States, you don't only have the issue of the 2001 cooperation with Afghanistan. Another major issue we could bring up as an example of how Iran is in favor of rapprochement is the Grand Bargain 2003. As American forces had taken Afghanistan and they marched into Baghdad, Iranians approached the United States via the Swiss ambassador, via the Swiss envoy based in Tehran, and they proposed to drop support for Hamas and Hezbollah. They proposed to curb their nuclear ambitions and far wider issues to be resolved with the United States. In exchange, they wanted security guarantees. As Dr. Parsi pointed out, that's supposed to already be provided by the United States, according to a 30-year-old agreement. So I don't believe it's in the DNA of Iran to be opposed to the US. Rather, what you should be looking at Iran's position through is a lens of realism, in which pressure will only invite more pressure if you bow under it. That's the only thing that will happen. And in terms of Iran's position on the Palestinian issue, Ayatollah Khomeini, he referred to the Palestinian issue as consisting of 3 layers. He says on the first level, it's a Palestinian question. On the second level, it's an Arab question. On the third level, it's an Islamic question. From this, we can construe that whatever the Palestinians decide, Iran will agree with. And this has been openly stated during the reformist era, and I believe that's the case today as well. So I do not believe that opposition to Israel or the United States is in the DNA of the government in Tehran. regarding the extent of support for the government and the relationship between the government and the Hausa, the religious leadership. It depends on what you define as government. If you define a government as, I mean, again, what do you mean by regime? Do you mean that by the Islamic Republic, or do you mean by the president?
I'm talking about the Supreme Ayatollah.
The supreme leader? Well, the Islamic Republic in the Constitution does not define the supreme leader as the highest religious authority. It defines him as the highest political authority. So constituents, according to the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, are not required to adhere to him as a supreme marja, if you would like to call it, like a source of emulation in religious matters. But it does so in political matters. There have always been, of course, divisions in the clergy. This is far wider than the Islamic Republic. It's a wider division in the Shia clergy about the role that clerics should play in politics. And no doubt this has become more active following the changes that we've seen in Iraq, with the clergy based in Najaf, which represent a more quietist strain of politics, taking a more pronounced role. I do not believe that there are visible tensions between the supreme leader and the clergy, not to an extent that would be seen as a game changer. Of course, there are tensions, but not as a game changer. When it comes to relations between Ahmadinejad and the clergy, of course, there are major issues. And this again goes back to his whole populist stance, which emphasizes anti-clericalism. Because one distinctive feature of the Islamic Revolution back in 1979 is that it was led by clerics. If you look at other Islamist movements in the Middle East, they've all been led by laymen. In Iran, that's the only case in which you had clerics actively leading a movement like that. So the other side of the spectrum, you have people who are laymen, such as Ahmadinejad, who are Islamists, but do not like clerics to lead the movement. And finally, the role of Iran and the U.S. position on Syria and what kind of challenges it can lead to. I do not believe that from the U.S. side there's a will to include Syria on the agenda right now. I think it's mostly from the Iranian side. The reason I believe that the Western members, or mainly the P5+1, do not want to include Syria and other peripheral issues to the nuclear issue is that they don't want lack of progress on these issues to lead to deadlock on the nuclear question, i.e. they don't want the nuclear dialogue to be held hostage to non-nuclear issues. Iran has repeatedly, in my view, been more open to inclusion of the U.S. on talks on Syria. Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Saleh has written op-eds openly calling for the United States to be involved in Syria on discussions of what happens there. He has called for a regional solution, but he hasn't expressed any kind of opposition to the United States being involved. His position is that Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia should meet and discuss what's happening with Bashar al-Assad and what will come next. So far, the Saudis have been the most opposed to these talks. And from the American side, there's been a consistent refusal to include Iran in any kind of forum on Syria. And this, again, goes back to a longer-term trend of American attempts to exclude Iran from regional forums on regional issues. The Americans have, for the past decades, to show their opposition to the Islamic Republic's policies, tried to shape the regional structure of decision-making. We've seen this on the Palestinian issue. Following the invasion of Iraq in 1991 by the United States, we had talks on something called the 6+2, which is the 6 members of the GCC, plus Egypt and Syria, providing security to deter Saddam Hussein. And at no point did it occur to the Americans that Iran should be included in talks on how to deter its own Western neighbor, which had invaded itself in 1980.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Okay. Regarding sanctions, I think just to concur with Mohammed, but also perhaps to give a kind of analogy, if you will, the kind of sanctions that we have on Iran now is the equivalent of a siege of a medieval city. And if you look, and you can go back to the literature and look at how those sieges tend to go. And the thing is, of course, at some point, everyone in the city is going to starve. But the people that will starve first are the ones who didn't have much to begin with. while everyone else, anyone who controls the gates of the city, anyone who has any outlet from the city, will continue to survive and might also in the short run thrive, because of course they can, what they charge for whatever is going through those loopholes will be much more. And in my opinion, that's also the reason why talking about the sanctions the way they are now, regardless of what you think of, what they are there for, the point is that to call them targeted is kind of silly. I'm not really sure what it is they're targeting. I mean, the target is just about everyone, so it doesn't leave anyone else out of it. And in that sense, you can say that the sanctions are having an effect on the Iranian economy and on the Iranian society, but they're not effective, because their effectiveness must be related to the stated goal for which they were implemented. And the stated goal was to get Iran to agree to certain things in the nuclear negotiations, and they have not. So yes, they're having an effect, but they're not effective. That remains to be seen. But then we've had these kind of sanctions for quite some time now, so I'm not holding my breath. As for the strategic goals of Tehran, I would agree again with Mohammad. Obviously, I think, my opinion is there are obviously those in Tehran who are very ideological. Most revolutions are not over after 30 years, and the repercussions in any case not. So there are those who are clinging on to the very kind of fiery rhetoric of the revolution. But I think, again, there you have to differentiate between what is said and what is actually done. And this is not to exonerate things that Tehran has done, but I think if you look at it with certain distance and with a cool-headedness, you will see that they haven't really done anything close to as much as they've talked. And in fact, it's almost inverted sometimes. The less they can do, the more they have to talk about it, because it's a way of compensating. I mean, if you look at the Palestinian issue, for instance, I mean, for reasons of both not wanting to get too dragged into it, or for basically not being able to do that much more, the more important it becomes to scream about it as often as loudly as possible, as a way of basically covering up the discrepancy between capability, willingness, and supposed ideological fervor, etc., etc. Qom and Tehran is a very complicated affair. I think we have to remember that Qom, which is the religious center in Iran for Shia Islam, has never really been that keen on meddling in politics in any direct way. If you look at it historically, you can say that the kind of involvement in politics that you have now in religious terms or justified through religion is an exception in Iranian Shiite history. That is not to say that clerics have not been interested in influencing politicians or the royal court before the Islamic Republic for centuries, preceding centuries, but that is not the same as having your hand at the steering wheel, so to speak, exactly because it tends to the blowback is not something you're interested in. So in that sense, I think probably, and this is just a guess, probably most people in Qom are not very much involved in the Islamic Republic as such. I mean, the group that Khomeini had around him when he fomented the revolution was a minority. And that minority has remained a minority, if you look at it broadly speaking. Obviously, there are some historical trends that are quite interesting. I think we have to remember that the Islamic Republic today actually has a special court where it can both fine and imprison clerics who are not towing the party line, if you will. That did not exist before. That has never existed because it was a collegial university-like system where basically you had no one above you. So it was among peers. You could exclude someone by freezing them out, but you cannot disrobe them, for instance. I mean, once they were ayatollahs, they were ayatollahs. Now they might only have 3 students because no one wanted to go to their classes, but they were still ayatollahs. But what you have now, of course, is a state that is speaking on behalf of religion, and that complicates things much more. And the Islamic Republic is actually the first time in Iranian history that the most important channel of independence for the clergy, which is the fact that they take up taxes, religious taxes directly, they get them directly from the believers who follow them, are now being re-channeled through the office of the supreme leader. So in that sense, you can say that historically speaking, you're having a state that is bureaucratizing religious hierarchy and actually creating religious hierarchy that did not exist in that sense because it was peer-reviewed, if you will. So that's just to give you a kind of historical background to what's going on. Regarding the United States and Syria, I think from my perspective, the problem with the way, for instance, Ms. Clinton shot down Kofi Annan's suggestion to have a contact group which included Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, is either there are two ways of reading it, if you will. Either that was done because everyone was so confident that Bashar al-Assad would be thrown out very quickly, so there was no point in bringing in the Iranians and having to do compromises that were not palatable, so to speak. Or the overall overarching goal is to isolate Iran at every turn possible. And so one was willing to do that, not then doing a proper cost-benefit analysis for what would that mean for the developments in Syria. In a sense, saying that everything else is never important enough for us to be realist about Iran's influence. The important thing is to always keep isolating Iran. And so Iran was excluded, and Syria is not resolved. Now, obviously, bringing Iran in wouldn't magically just resolve things, but at least it would have given you a channel into Damascus and Bashar al-Assad himself, if you wanted to try something that was more peaceful than what we have now.
Thank you, Rusbe. I know there are other questions, and I'd happily sit here and talk about this for the rest of the afternoon, but unfortunately, time's up. So please join me in thanking our speakers for their very interesting insight on Iran.